Welcome to the Software Security Gurus webcast with John Melton. Welcome to the show, John.
Hey, thanks. I appreciate it.
Of course, anytime, John. Hey, John, do you mind sharing a few words about yourself?
Sure, sure. So I'm the director of product security at NetSuite, which is an Oracle company. And yeah, I went through school. I was going to be a developer, mostly excited by development, and was coming up on graduation around the time of the bubble burst, and decided it was a good time to spend a little bit more time in school. So I went through grad school to do security, and then I've just kind of threaded that needle for the rest of my career between bouncing back and forth between development and security. The last maybe 5 years, I've been pure security and building security programs, AppSec programs predominantly.
You've done way more than that, and let's dive right into it. Yeah, you've done a ton more. So I actually have three topics in mind for today's webcast, and hopefully they are near and dear to your heart. And the first one I would like to start with the tail end, which is today. When I looked at your resume, it actually I noticed it immediately that you're jumping back and forth between development and security. The second thing that I noticed is the fact that you moved the ladder very quickly within NetSuite. In 1 year, you moved from a senior to be a manager, to be a director. And I'll be honest, John, that means you must do something right. And I'm actually very curious, like, what is the secret? Like, what are you doing today, or what did you do in the last 5 years that really made an impact within NetSuite and got you where you are right now?
Sure. So I think there's probably a personal side to that, and an actual, more technical side that's more interesting to the audience. I think on the personal side, I kind of jumped into technical leadership and management early in my career, and that was a mistake for me personally. I wasn't ready. I didn't have the empathy to lead people. I was more interested in the tech, and really selfish at that point. And I pushed people a little too hard and wasn't empathetic, and so kind of burnt out a little bit, honestly, and went back to pure tech. And I was a little gun shy on that for a while. And then the opportunity came up to come to NetSuite. And prior to NetSuite, I'd been at a product company, which was really beneficial for me to go between being part of a program. I had come from Wells Fargo to being a vendor for a little while and kind of understanding more what a broader scope of companies are trying to deal with, right? There are the big enterprises, there are the small startups, and I could see everything in between. And that was really, really helpful for me. So when I landed at NetSuite, I was actually brought in to deal with a company they had acquired, which was a real DevOps focused, very modern development shop. And I had the opportunity to build an AppSec program from the ground up, which was really, really fun. And they were doing some good security practices, but they didn't have a dedicated security person, if that makes sense, right? Mm-hmm. So they had some practices in place that were great, but they didn't have anybody with kind of the mindset necessarily of security or the technical backing. So I was able to jump in, and we made some really quick, effective gains within that first year. And so they took that and replicated me over to NetSuite more globally. So I got the chance to run the AppSec program there. And I think moving to manage product security, which covers both AppSec, but also what you would typically call security architecture, the assurance or pen testing teams. And then we have another tooling squad in there that's a support layer. Really boils down to trying to have a vision, I think, right? An overall program scope and laying that plan out. And fortunately, people saw the value in that. And I think that only worked for me because, number one, I try to learn from lots and lots and lots of people. I try to focus a lot on what people fail at, which I think is really, really helpful. This is my quick plug for something I've been trying to get going for a long time. So maybe people who listen to this will build a failure con. I would attend, and I would be happy to speak at. Or build failure tracks into your cons. That's more interesting to me than anything else. Because a lot of times you hear people come into these cons and they'll say, look, I did this thing and I'm so awesome. And you go, well, yeah, you are awesome, but I am not awesome apparently because I couldn't get that thing to work. It'd be really helpful if people would, have an eye towards, this is the 18 ways that I failed. And so really, I think it was just banging my head against the wall for a long time technically and seeing what worked and what didn't work, and then having more confidence in the programmatics around things. And also, again, personally, just I had built over time that empathy for seeing other people and how they had developed and, just basically maturing in experience, but also really getting excited about the people management portion, right? Being able to celebrate other people, see them succeed, trying to build plans for them and help them help them be effective in their careers and their personal life, and trying to really just care for people. In that intervening time, I became a parent, which is, all of us experience that change, and we go, I think, naturally more towards caring for others, and so that was certainly the case for me.
Yeah, it's an interesting experience. If you're young, you think about yourself, and you're not going fast, or you're not climbing that ladder fast enough. Right. But then when you're older and you're trying even to make more other people successful, you become even more successful in what you're doing. But so fantastic to hear that what you've done at Bronto, you were able to copy or replicate, but also in a scalable way then, because there's only one of you. So you must have figured something out that you were able to either replicate yourself or scale that, because you said also architecture analysis, and that is manual, labor intensive. So how did you do that?
Yeah, great question. And certainly, I should give credit to everybody that works for me because they're the ones doing all the real work. But I think for the programmatics of the thing, every program matures over time. So you always start with ad hoc, and you're doing a thing here and a thing there, and you're kind of throwing darts at the board to see what sticks at the beginning. And then you kind of, I'm a big believer in OWASP Top 10 at scale. Right? At scale, OWASP Top 10 makes sense. And that makes sense because they're surveying thousands of companies, and in the data in aggregate is going to make sense, right? Like OWASP Top 10 is probably going to prove to be true in aggregate. But statistics don't matter to the individual. So for your company, you don't have an OWASP Top 10. You have those 1, 2, or 3 that you should focus on, and your business risk and those kind of things, and your environment and all those kind of things. So as an example, at NetSuite, we run a platform where we allow our customers, partners, our employees themselves to write code that executes on our platform. So we have RCE as a service, right? Yeah. That's a thing that not every company does, and so that's a unique thing that we have to contend with, and those are worries and areas of enormous risk for us that not necessarily everybody else is going to have to address. We also host websites for our customers, again, something not everybody's going to have to address, and so we've got a lot of institutional knowledge that we worked from, but also where we are seeing the most lift, I think, is certainly everybody talks about automation. I mean, that's kind of, at this point, you have to do that. Trying to be intentional about training our people in the right way to do things. We're big believers in the notion that I know is near and dear to you of invariance, right? So as opposed to, that's a great thing about Sensei, right, which we use and like, which is as opposed to saying you're doing a bad thing, we want to say, here's the good thing, the right thing, the thing we've chosen. Other people have referred to this as guardrails, the paved path, right? This is an idea that's been around for a while. And actually, I think that's the secret sauce behind safe companies. The more safe, more secure companies have figured out that they can channel their development teams into these paved paths. I always pick on Netflix in this regard because they talk about it a lot. Netflix has a stellar security team, and I know several of the people there. I believe in them a lot. They're a fantastic team, but I don't think they would be as effective as a security team if it weren't for their engineering model, which is you pick 1 or 2 things and the stack is fully well supported. Everything's there kind of laid out for you, and it's hard to make a mistake. If they were, you can pick anything in the world and we're going to just try to secure it all, you can't pull that off. And so that's really the model that we choose, and that bleeds over into everything. So we've got a architecture team, which we call security consulting internally, because we want to consult with our teams. And they are really focused on understanding what people are trying to do, at scale because they talk to lots of people, and then building patterns, standards and patterns that are paved paths. So if you need to do, IAM, this is the way we do IAM. If you need to do key management, this is the way we do key management. And here's the full stack for you. Here's the technology stack. Here's the tooling. Here's the everything. And then feeding out of that, our engineering staff builds rules that ensure we go down that path and looks for aberrations from that. Our assurance team tests that we're on that path, and then our tooling team builds tools to automate all of that stuff. So that's kind of how. I think that's what has been most effective for us. That's kind of the secret sauce, as it were, that I've seen other groups talk about and tried to infer from successful teams. They always seem to have successful security teams. Always seem to be attached to really great engineering teams, and really great engineering teams usually seem to be pretty narrow in scope of what they allow. It's not, you can't do 67 different, the same thing 67 different ways. You pick one or two ways.
Mm-hmm. I can see why you're successful at what you're doing, because I couldn't agree more. Like, if you can bake as many things as possible into your platform, just do it. Right. Then especially focus on the areas that you need to focus on, and that's different for every company. And then, right. Yes, security by, making sure that the developers know what the standards are, and that they know what the right way of coding is, the secure way of coding, which needlessly flows into my second topic, which is 10 years ago, you actually co-authored a paper called Aside. It's an IDE support for web application security, and that was published in 2011. I have to admit, it's super inspirational. I think it's very visionary, because you were talking about an IDE which was at that time not commercially available into the market. Do you mind sharing a little bit more about what you've done over there, and how that evolved and how that affected you?
Sure. So that was a paper I co-authored with some folks from my alma mater, UNC Charlotte. And UNC Charlotte is one of the organizations, it's where I graduated from, and it went through they were one of the first, dozen or so schools that was rubber stamped by the NSA as the Scholarship for Service producing schools. So for those unfamiliar, the U.S. government discovered that in maybe the mid-2000s that the private market was paying security people a lot more than the public market was. And so they figured out that a lot of people were exiting, particularly their younger staff, and a lot of their older staff was getting closer to retirement. So they set up a scholarship program, and that's been ongoing. I was the beneficiary of that in one of the first rounds that came out. But they've coordinated with a lot of universities across the country to help build curriculums and research programs and those kind of things that really focus on software security at its core. And our university had spent a lot of effort in the static analysis space initially, but then it mutated a little bit over to, I guess, what's classically called HCI, Human Computing Interface. Most people nowadays call it user experience or developer experience. And so the idea was, okay, we have these classical models based on static analysis, based on compilers, that we can give some information about something that is secure or not. Now, how do we get people to actually do that, right? Your background in Fortify, right? Fortify or any of the static analyzers will build you a big old pile of problems,
yep.
Right? And what do I do with that big old pile of problems? Well, I could go cut 500,000 tickets for a dev team. That may or may not be effective. So you always end up in, the classic answer for static analysis is, how do I scale triage? How do I scale bug fixing? All that kind of thing. And some of the thinking there has been, we can solve this with safe libraries. So instead of, Google's a good example here. Instead of solving SQL injection 100,000 times, they went and built out a safe library for SQL. Christoph Kern has a really good paper where he and others, he's the lead on that paper, and he's given a couple talks about it. It's really excellent, where they went after SQL injection and cross-site scripting. But for SQL injection, they built an API and a library wrapping that, and just made the problem go away. So if you've got 10,000 findings, but you can convert the code over via automation and whatnot, that's a great solution. But that's a pretty mature solution. And you can't necessarily do that unless you happen to own the database like Google did. When you build the database driver, you can solve that problem. But for most mortals, that's not an option. And so what do we do in normal situations? Well, we have to get where the developer is. And that tool at the time was meant to help train and change the workflow at the time. So most of the research was focused on, can we turn a developer who is uneducated about these issues into a trained, understanding developer via the IDE without going the separate training route and specific training? This is obviously something you care about with Secure Code Warrior and Sensei. That research was obviously basic research, and it was really effective at proving out that it's possible. It's not always effective, but it's possible to boil the ocean, right? You can make people better by targeting them where they are at that moment. And so all the things I talked about at NetSuite were informed certainly by that research. How do we change it at that moment? How do we get people at the right point in time? How do we build safe libraries in those cases where we can to give them a paved path, and they go in and they type, some Hibernate library, and we're going to save that data off. Well, there may be nothing wrong, nothing insecure with that. But we as an organization have chosen not to use that library. We're going to choose this one API that we chose as an organization. And now we've kind of solved that problem without a bunch of chagrin on the developer's part, without a bunch of retraining, without a bunch of bug fixes and tickets and whatnot. And so we can inform that dev path through the IDE, which is where the devs live.
The last piece of the puzzle is indeed making sure they are aware, and you give that information at the right time in the right moment when they're there, when they need that particular API. Yes, you're still a big believer. I'm still a big believer too. Fantastic.
Yeah, and a quick side note there, a lot of the basic research that we started with there was based on training, and not specifically InfoSec training, but just training in general, which was saying things like, if you do yearly training, which every corporation does, most people forget 80 to 90% of that in a matter of 2 days. That's kind of the answer. So hopefully a few things stick, but you can expect them to stick with everything. And so that contextual time-sensitive training is really, really helpful, and it helps lock that thing in their brain.
Yep.
And obviously does enforcement.
Couldn't agree more. Last topic, if you don't mind. You
Sure.
are one of the authors, founders of the OWASP AppSensor, and I'm not sure if you've seen it, but congratulations, it's 10 years old, my friend. Which means it's ancient.
I am old. Holy cow.
Yes, it is. One thing that I've noticed is, it's a decade old, and I would say it has been given a lot of attention for the first 9 years, but for some reason, the last year, either you were on a break, or the world has moved on, or today's coding is totally different. But can you give a little bit more insight on the project itself and where you think we are today with that project and the need for that project?
Sure, absolutely. So I'll try to keep it tight, but I will ramble here for a minute.
Go for
it. The history is funny. So I was at the time when I started working on AppSensor, I was at a bank, and I was DevOps before there was a word for DevOps. I was dev, but I was also supporting this. And I got really frustrated at having to fix bugs that, or find and fix bugs that I'm like, my code should be handling this for me. And most of the exceptional conditions were just business logic errors. And the intuition that got me was, this is not the first, it's not a one-off, it wasn't a null pointer exception, right? In other words, it wasn't just a plain coding exception. It was a business logic flow exception where the user had done a particular activity. And most of the time, they were doing that more than once. So I could have detected it if I was looking for it. And so I started hacking together some basic, bash automation to parse log files and this, that, and the other. And then the light bulb went off that, I can do this in the application and have the application solve that problem for me. I thought I was a genius, and I went out and it's like, I'm going to do research because this idea is going to change the world. And lo and behold, there's at this point, decades of research in fraud detection that I was unfamiliar with from academia. And I discovered that, and I was like, oh, maybe I'm not so clever. And also unbeknownst to me, about 6 months before that, Michael Coates, who runs Altitude Networks now, at the time he was working at Twitter? I forget their name. Nope, it was before Twitter, the consultancy up in Maryland. I forget the name of it, but it's a it's a security consultancy. I'll think of it in a minute. It was Jeff Williams and
Aspect.
Thank you, Dave's old company. So he was working at Aspect, and he had written through the OWASP Summer of Code, he had written a paper on AppSensor. He had already had the name together and this, that, and the other. And so I discovered it. I went out, and they had a little bit of code there, and I went out and filed a bunch of bugs. And Michael responded to the mailing list. I joined the mailing list. He responded to the mailing list and said something to the effect of, "Hey, everybody, I want to introduce our new dev lead, John Melton." And so I back channel messaged him, and I said, "Hey, man, we don't know each other that well. What are you talking about?" And his response was something along the lines of, "Well, I'm not the right person to lead dev on this, and it looks like you're interested. So do you want to do it?" And so I kind of got guilted into it. But I'm super happy that I did. It's opened a lot of doors, and I really do believe in the project. Fast forward a little, Colin Watson out of the UK. He's the real hero on AppSensor because he wrote the vast majority of that paper book. It's a couple hundred pages long, very detailed. It stands the test of time. If you're interested in this topic, you should definitely go read it, skim it. Great work from Colin. And I led up development. For those who are not familiar, AppSensor, the idea is that you can detect attackers, not necessarily attacks. And the intuition there is that if you look for what an attacker is trying to do, oftentimes that will stand out, right? So, your classic WAF is going to detect XSS and SQLi. But if you see somebody start poking at certain things, oftentimes you can tell that's just bad behavior. And this comes out of fraud detection and all of that work as well. But oftentimes you can see bad behavior starting to raise its head, and you can say, well, this person's done N number of these things. We can now classify them as being dangerous. So two things I talk about there. One is Ryan Barnett, who used to work with TrustWave. He did a research project with Mod Security WAF where he invited all the best SQLi hackers around the world he set up, standard mod security and asked them to break it. And they broke it. They broke SQLi. But the minimum number of tries that it took to break was 80 and change, 81, 82. And the intuition there was, if I was looking for numbers 1 through 80, I could have tripped an alarm at 10 or 15. If you've tried 10 or 15 SQLi attacks, you're not a normal user, right? Let me just shut you down. And the other thing there is more of an intuition around that helps kind of cement the idea of AppSensor, which is if you imagine a banking account and you log into your online banking and you've got your list of accounts, you got a savings and a checking and maybe 2 savings and a checking, and you click that link and it takes you to the detail page about that. Well, if you imagine what's happening behind the scenes, you've got some kind of an identifier from the database, a GUID, a auto increment, whatever. And you click on that, and it takes you to that detail page. Somehow that click communicated to the back end, this is what I want to see. And there was an authorization check that should have happened there to ensure that I'm looking at the things that I can access. Well, if I get back accounts, 5, 6, and 7, and I send a request for 7, that's a normal flow. If I send a request for 255 and it wasn't presented to me in the screen, that's an immediate alarm bell going off. And that means one of 2 things has happened. Either your app is broken and it's presenting me things I shouldn't see, or 2, I'm being a bad person. I'm doing some nefarious activity. And so the intuition behind AppSensor is that I want to look for those conditions, typically things that you might find in threat modeling or talking to developers about what are the non-happy path flows, and then put sensors everywhere in your code. And there's AppSensor, the idea, which is what I just described, and then AppSensor, the toolkit, which is the code base. And the toolkit itself was the primary thing I worked on. And it essentially provides you a back end that allows you to write rules and collect these data points and do analyses and that kind of thing. And so the notion is that you would send over those signals, you'd have a back end running, and then that would give you a mechanism for responding in some way, logging, paging people, blocking accounts, whatever response you want to take. So why has it not changed a whole lot here recently? So the primary reasons are John is lazy. That's a big one. And the secondary
John is busy, right? That's what you said, right?
John is lazy busy. Yep. And the real reason is actually, for the most part, it just works, right? Mm-hmm. It's real simple. There's not much to it. I'm not trying to solve the world's problems. I'm trying to give a simple toolkit. And so usually when I talk to people about AppSensor, there's kind of the three phases is what I would describe. First is you start understanding the idea. The idea is the trick for AppSensor. Really, it's not the code, it's not the toolkit, it's the idea. If that intuition makes sense to you, you can now solve lots of problems. And it's an accretive effect, right? Because the first sensor that I trip or that I embed in my code, I start getting good data. The second, third, and fourth give me additional good data. The 100th still accretes my value. And over time, I'm able, just like an MVP in development, right? I'm able to get value all along the way. And so that's really helpful. The second phase would be looking for something like an AppSensor toolkit where I need something that'll help me get going and, at whatever scale I'm starting with. Google, Facebook, Twitter, they're not going to pull AppSensor in and have it work, right? They have a different level of scale problem. So at some point, you're going to hit a scale threshold where AppSensor Toolkit is not your right solution, right? It'll work fine for I'd say small to medium scale. Once you hit high scale, you're going to want to build your own implementation. So Michael Coates had built an implementation at Mozilla that they used. It was based on Python, which was their dev language. And they did some really interesting things. A lot of financials look at AppSensor because it helps them solve some compliance financials and healthcare. That's a lot of the people that talk to me. And then there's been some really interesting work more recently, and I'm going to butcher the name of the company. I can't remember. I just talked to a guy. I tweeted it out. Maybe we can link it later after the talk.
Okay.
But they're doing some really interesting work around connecting the operations security side to the development side and being able to look at that data, pulling it out of WAFs and gluing all that stuff together using the I forget what's the popular framework for security operations red teaming anymore. There's a NIST frame, or maybe not a NIST framework. Anyway, there's a framework that people are operating out of on that side of the house, and so they're looking at purple teaming and solving a lot of these problems. So they go in, they pen test, they find a set of problems, they work with the blue team to build detections for those sets of problems, and then they cycle, right?
Okay.
And all the time they're accreting this data. Now they're putting that data, I think, in Elk at the time, or maybe Splunk, but feeding it into a SIEM and working in that way. So there's lots of options there, and they put out some really novel research here recently. It was good work.
So bottom line, it works, it keeps working, and it's going to be here 10 years from now?
That's a great question. I would love if the answer is it goes away. One thing I should mention, there are some vendors in this space who are coming around. So some of your RASP type companies, right? And that is the way that, again,
professionally supported,
I love open source.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. There's a high bar of confidence you have to have in a system that might be blocking attacks, right? And having professional support's a great thing. I think the real value in AppSensor, even though I worked on the code for a lot, I think the real value is in that idea. If you can get hold of that idea and start putting it in your environment and executing on it and saying, it's a natural outflow of threat modeling with your developers and with your architects and saying, what is if this is the happy path, just like we talked about with development, right? Hibernate may be completely safe, but we don't use that because it's not on our happy path. If you've got a happy path of a logical business flow through the application and you see aberrations from that, why let the person just do that all day, right?
Yep.
Eventually, after 80 tries, they're going to pop SQL. Just stop them before that. And so I think that mind shift, that light bulb going off, is the real value in AppSensor.
Absolutely.
And then, use the toolkit if you want, and certainly bug me if you need things fixed.
I hope it's still here 10 years from now, although you disagree.
Yep.
But hey, last question.
I hope the idea is here. I hope somebody else has built something better by then. Yeah.
Last question. You love code, and I know that you've been involved in teaching people how to code, like you were involved in CodeMash and KidsMash. What do you recommend your kids to code on, or you don't care and they play Fortnite?
So we're not a big games family. We're not a huge screen time family. We are my life goal, like, it seems increasingly I see this because of COVID. My life goal is to throw my computers away the day that I retire and just be on the farm. I like farming and gardening and that kind of thing. So my kids have hatchets and they go out and play and cut down trees and have a good time. That being said, obviously, there's a lot of benefit to tech. And so I do teach them coding. We started with Scratch. We started with some basic books. We worked into Python. It is not the thing they're going to pick on their day off, if that makes sense, right? So I'm intentional about it. But I have taken the approach of I want them to be cognizant of coding, but I have the same belief in when I'm teaching anybody to code, right? Coding, you have to have a desire to do it like any other job. But you can pick up the semantics pretty easily. And really what I want them to do is have the mindset of thinking about how to break down problems, right? The engineering mindset. And so we spend a lot of time on logic and basic engineering and physics and that kind of thing. Fascinating learning, seeing things with new eyes through kids. So that's really fun. But yeah, Python, Scratch is great.
Yep.
I think they did the hour of code thing at school. That's kind of when they were 5 or 6. That was the way we kind of got introduced to it. And 5-year-olds don't really grok coding, but so we can try.
Okay, so 10 years from now, they are actually gonna they will be the developers that maintain AppSensor. That's correct, right?
That's the plan. Yes,
and you
that's
can retire.
Anybody who wants to take that work, yes. I really want them to be able to. I think of coding as a superpower, right? And I talk to all our security people. We actually hire for programming and can teach security better than the opposite way.
Yeah. Absolutely right.
And programming is great in that you can take something from an idea to a thing. That's always fascinated me, right? The first day I saw that, I was like, whoa. It's kind of the same idea with this 3D printing that we got here recently, which is, wait, I can have an idea, I can draw it, and then it becomes a physical thing, right? And so that's what I want them to appreciate. And anybody that comes into our field, I want people to work on security problems or dev problems or whatever they are, and be fascinated by them, and have a passion for it. I get a little bit passionate when I talk about these things.
Yep. Great note to finish this off. Sure. John, thank you very, very much for accepting to be the 14th guru on the Software Security Gurus webcast. It was a fantastic chat. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.